Hey folks, Mike Dakkak with you. I want you to head over to marketplace.drstellamd.com. That's marketplace.drstellamd.com. That's where you can find all the health and wellness products you need to make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. She's got Vax detox bundles, pandemic preparedness kits, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine supplies. You can sign up for a telehealth session and get the care you need from a doctor who's been telling us the truth about health and wellness and COVID from the very beginning. Head on over to marketplace.drstellamd.com. Use promo code ITN as Dr. Stella, who's a friend of the show and a friend to freedom-loving patriots everywhere, has agreed to give ITN viewers a generous discount. Take care of yourselves and your families by going to marketplace.drstellamd.com and getting the supplies you need to remain prepared. Tell them Mike sent you. Ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to welcome our guest today. We have the one and only Mandy Gunasekara, who is an author and a former chief of staff at the EPA under President Trump. Mandy, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you, Mike.
For people who are not familiar, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your journey, your career, your experience in DC, and how exactly you got here.
Yeah, well, I grew up the daughter of a military officer, so I was in a household where civil service was something that was kind of expected. And I ultimately ended up doing an internship the summer after my undergraduate in college and went to Washington, D.C., and I fell in love with the hustle and bustle of Capitol Hill. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or how I would fit in, but I knew I wanted to be a part of it. So fast forward a couple of years, over a decade that I spent in DC, where I worked in the House of Representatives, I worked in the US Senate, and then ultimately worked for President Trump during the first administration, first in a policy role running his Office of Air and Radiation, which is why I had a key role in the president getting out of the Paris Climate Accord and really rolling back a lot of the unnecessary red tape put in place by the EPA, and then ultimately ended up as the chief of staff. So in a leadership position overseeing the 10 regional offices all across the country, as well as the 12 DC based offices within the district.
Were you always awake, not woke, awake? Did you always know the truth, or were you red pilled like me?
I actually got a lot more conservative when I was in DC. I grew up in a conservative house, military from the deep South, so I had the environmental setting for that. But I didn't really think in depth about a lot of the policies that are kind of thrown in your face, especially when you work in a personal office on the U.S. House of Representatives. People will call you and your representative that you represent about anything and everything. So I had to figure out really quick what the issues were, get a working knowledge of them, and then understand the conservative perspective versus the liberal perspective and where I ultimately fell. And really being in Washington, D.C., I became a lot more conservative.
That is fascinating to me. I find that experience invaluable when you actually speak to real voters, people who take the time to pick up the phone and call their representative, because then they're really worked up if they're doing that. What were you hearing from folks during that time? What are some of the issues that really got them worked up?
Yeah, well, the economy is always the top of the list for folks. The ebbs and flows of it. The district that I worked in, there were a lot of farmers, and so the ebbs and flow of the commodity marketplace was something we heard a lot about. We heard a lot about corn policy and soybean policy, as well as fuels policy. There was a large refiner based in that district, so we heard that all the way to cultural issues about people angry, and rightfully so, about efforts to expand access to abortion or taxpayer funded abortion. We heard a lot about that. That really got people upset, again, rightfully so. And then funding for NPR, it's expanded to CBS and NBC these days. But when I was really hearing directly from a broad range of constituents, it was in the mid 20 teens. And those were really the issues that were at the top of the ticket.
That's awesome. It sounds like your constituents that you were serving were really kind of ahead of the curve on a lot of these issues. How did the environment become your issue?
So going back to one of my earlier internships, I interned all the way through law school. When you intern as a law student, they call you a law clerk to make you feel more knowledgeable, I guess, but it's really the same job. I ended up doing research on various emissions outputs of various facilities, whether it was a factory, an industrial operation, or vehicles, the day-to-day things that we do that have some sort of emissions output. I was trying to put that in context because I was there during the summer of cap and trade. This is going back to 2009 when the Democrats were trying to put a price on carbon. And this is before President Obama, or former President Obama, embraced the pen and phone initiative and was actually trying to get legislation through Congress. Now, of course, even in a Democrat controlled Senate, mind you, they could not pass a price on carbon because the American people, they largely see through the con job or the hoax, whatever moniker you want to place on putting a price on carbon. And they also understand the very real impacts, which means the price of everything goes up because the price of gasoline, the price of electricity, it all goes up. And so it's a hard sell to the American people. President Obama and his team learned that the hard way. And I was in the thick of it doing research on the various impacts of emissions control policy. And that's really how I got into working for environmental leaders. And I ended up in a job working at the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which gave me the opportunity to be responsible for oversight of Obama's climate action plan, which was his pen and phone initiative. When the legislation failed, he turned to EPA and other agencies and tried to ram these bad policy ideas down the throats of the American people using the various agencies as his tool of choice. And I performed significant oversight from the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and really refined my interest, knowledge, and relative network around a whole host of environmental issues.
It's called the Pen and Phone Initiative because he famously couldn't get any of this junk passed through Congress. In other words, passed by we the people. And so he famously said, I have a pen and I have a phone and I'm going to try and push all this stuff through. I think it's rather telling that he couldn't get it through the Senate, even though Democrats had control. You worked for Senator Inhofe, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. He was the chairman of the committee.
Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma.
Yes.
He said something that really started to wake me up. I didn't realize it at the time, but it really started to wake me up when it came to the climate issue. He said, people want to control carbon emissions because if you control carbon output, you control life. There is really no aspect of life that does not touch carbon, or maybe the other way around. Carbon does not touch. There is no aspect of life that carbon does not touch. And so it's a control mechanism. And it's a powerful control mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, Senator Inhofe was actually quoting one of the scientists that had testified before the committee that was warning if we embrace these types of policies, it would lead to exactly what you just honed in on, which was controlling carbon is a means for the left to control every aspect of people's lives. And the reason it's so impactful is because the Earth systems, they're pretty complicated. Even though we have a basic understanding of how they work, you take each Earth system and you try to bundle that up together with climate change, the ever evolving climate, which has been the case since the beginning of time. And there's a lot of complications to that. There's a lot of things that we don't know, which some people don't want to admit, but that is still very much the case if you talk to the range of climate scientists that I talked to. But that lack of understanding, that ambiguity, if you will, it becomes a powerful force to inject false stories and fear. And the left loves to use fear to push their policies, because unless their policies are pushed up against some catastrophic future, they really aren't reasonable or something that the American people would generally entertain. They literally have to say to the American people, if you do not embrace this policy where you hand over some of your rights and responsibilities to me and the people that I represent, then the world will come to an end. And that typically is the case, that people are willing to accept giving up some of those rights and responsibilities. We saw it on full display during COVID, but they've been doing the same thing when it comes to climate change for a very long time.
I think that's 100% accurate. I think that's a very astute point. Al Gore put out that movie, An Inconvenient Truth, in the mid 2000s, and he said the world was going to end like in 10 minutes. Here we are 20 years later, and nothing has gone. It's a hoax. It's all a hoax. Here's a question I would like to ask you. I consider myself, believe it or not, an environmentalist. I care about the environment. I don't like things washing up on my beaches. I don't like it when corporations dump toxic waste in clean water. I am a person who actually separates my recyclables. I actually rinse out my recyclables. People think I'm crazy when I do that. When we go to on a hike, I am the person that says we're going to leave this place exactly the same as the way we found it, if not better. But I also understand now, my eyes have been opened, that our friends on the other side do not care about the environment. This is a control mechanism. That's all it is for them. They could care less about the environment. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting up windmills in my home state of New Jersey that absolutely, first of all, they do not decompose. They get thrown into landfills. They're killing whales left and right. They don't care about this kind of stuff. It turns out that we care more about the environment than they do. But I guess my question is, where is there a political home for me, someone like me who actually cares but really cares? Not, it's not just a talking point. I don't want to pay it lip service. I actually want to help the planet.
Yeah, your home is with the America First movement.
Yeah.
And the truth is, and this is something that really got my interest in shifting from pure policy into the communications forum, Republicans and the America First movement have a really great platform when it comes to tangibly protecting the environment with practical solutions that
Yes.
aren't going to bankrupt families or the economy. We've been doing this. We know how to do it quite well. We did it successfully in the first Trump administration in terms of cleaning up the air, cleaning up the water, and addressing legacy pollution. That is still a very real issue. That's a major barrier for a lot of communities. These communities largely represent the forgotten men and women that were drawn to President Trump because he would listen to them, and he wouldn't just listen, he would do what he does best, which is take action. So
Mm.
your home fits squarely within the policies of the Republican Party that have been amped up in the America First movement that really embrace a balance between environmental protection in real ways, alongside continued economic growth, which is necessary for the prosperity of humanity, which is equally important when you're talking about a holistic, healthy environment.
You mentioned the red tape a moment ago. Let's talk about the red tape. You find yourself working for President Trump during his first administration. How much red tape? How bad is it?
Oh, it's really bad, and during the Obama administration and then the Biden administration, they really turned it up full throttle. The amount of red tape, it doesn't just add costs to everyday men and women and the economy as well. It also adds liability, which is a major problem in terms of trying to attract investment and grow the economy. So the
Mm.
first go round, we had a requirement for every one regulation put in place, you took two off the books. This go round, President Trump really understood the magnitude of the problem. And so that's why he put in place this 10-to-1. For every new regulation going on the books, he wanted to get rid of 10 regulations because he knew that there were at least 10 that could easily go away. It wouldn't hinder the ability of various agencies to fulfill their legally mandated missions from Congress, but it would do a lot in terms of cutting unnecessary costs and reducing liability, which would revitalize and reinvigorate the industrial aspects of our country and the economy, something President Trump has made front and center, not just in his first term, but his second term as well.
Do you agree with that ratio? Is it really 10 to 1?
Yeah, it is.
That's absolutely mind-boggling to me. Give us an idea of what these folks, these entrenched bureaucrats, what exactly do they do to hinder an agenda, especially specifically when it comes to the environment?
Well, what they did at EPA, what I saw firsthand, they do everything from just take their time. They will pretend like you
The
didn't
slow
give clear
walk.
direction. And the thing is, when you are a political appointee, you're handling 20 major regulatory actions at any given moment. And so you meet with each team to see how these various regulatory actions are progressing. You're going to meet them once every 2 weeks at best. And so what they can do is they can just not do the work that you gave them direction on. When you meet them again 2 weeks later, they're at the exact same place that you were 2 weeks ago. So that's sort of your basic. The other thing they'll do is we call it planting regulatory or legal bombs in the regulatory proposals. Once these things are finalized, if they have some legal fallacy, interestingly, the third party activist friends of the regulators that put in these legal bombs, something that really undermined the veracity of those legal claims, the third party activists would know about that. They would point it out, they would take you to court, and then you wouldn't be able to uphold judicial scrutiny because it would be found to not withstand legal scrutiny by the acts of the bureaucrats that put in shoddy legal analysis that we, the political, may or may not have actually caught. And so that was sort of the early days when you first come in, you don't really understand how the deep state works. You figure that out pretty quick, and you figure out ways to really make sure you read through all of the key legal aspects as well as the supporting facts. Those are things that they do, but they also take it a step further. And this is in my book. The deep state, they didn't just want to stop the president's policies, which is unconstitutional, but they also wanted to demean, demoralize, and discredit the people like myself who were political appointees working to get those things over the finish line. So they would start anonymous investigations from various inspector bodies. The inspector general, for example, is a tool that was actually used against a lot of appointees to start these investigations, knowing that even if it's based off of absolutely nothing, you cannot go in, you being a person who is potentially charged with some anonymous problem that has started this investigation. You cannot go into those without legal representation. So you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars. They did this all the time. They would leak information to the press designed to undermine the ability to get these things done. And then, the most egregious thing, this is the first story that I talk about in my book, but I went on an international trip, and the deep state handled all of my various logistics. This is standard practice when you're a federal employee going to do something on behalf of the agency or the president you represent. And they put me up in a sex hotel 45 minutes away from where the actual negotiations were going on. Just a mean form of bullying and harassment to try to stop me from being effective in my job that President Trump had asked me to actually get done.
That's it. So wait, just so we're clear, when a sex hotel meaning what exactly? Meaning a place where prostitutes would go and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I saw when I checked in, it took a while. It was me, and out of 120 entire delegates, me and one other female colleague who was also from EPA, we were the only two that ended up at this hotel. And while we were downstairs trying to work things out because we realized that this wasn't a normal hotel that you would go, I saw two prostitutes walk out, very clearly get into a car and probably zoom off to their next job.
That's psychological abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I called at the time. I called my chief of staff, and when I first told him, he thought I was joking. And then when he realized it wasn't a joke, it was very, very serious. And the State Department folks who were on the ground, they couldn't be bothered by it. They really couldn't be bothered by it. All the hotels and all the land apparently were full, and they couldn't get us out of this hotel. So we had to spend a night there until I broke protocol and used my own credit card to book my own lodging. And myself and my other adult female colleague, we shared a hostel somewhere else that was closer to the negotiations and cut our trip short.
That's absolutely infuriating. And this is the kind of stuff that doesn't make it to the headlines, but it's very real and it affects policy and it affects your life if you are living in this country. So I am thrilled at the fact that you are bringing this to our attention. Something else that you talk about that is near and dear to my heart because I think it fits in the same category. We don't concentrate on this enough. The money laundering that goes with the NGOs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, EPA is ground zero for some of the worst schemes. There was a whole office created during the Biden administration. They called it the Environmental Justice Office. And the reason they did that is because if you or I asked questions about the legitimacy of environmental justice, they could say that we were racist or bigoted or something along those lines. That's why they called it environmental justice, because if you weren't for it, there was something obviously morally wrong with you, which was their whole point. So they set up this office, and then they to the tune of $20 billion set up a taxpayer money laundering scheme to try and give billions of dollars to nonprofits that do more to expand the political reach of the left to instead of actually helping low income or minority communities communities deal with some legacy environmental issue. And so they come up with these nice names, and then they take taxpayer dollars, they launder it through, and if you ask questions, they will point the finger back at you and tell you you're a bad person. And EPA really was one of the worst because they not only pushed this money through EPA, but they also did it in ways to avoid basic agency oversight. Administrator Lee Zeldin and his team discovered on day one in this Trump administration that there was a $20 billion account that had been set up out of the reach, or attempted to be out of the reach of the federal government, to avoid basic oversight. And this was one where folks may have seen headlines. There was a nonprofit run by none other than Stacey Abrams, a known politico of the left, to the tune of $2 billion, a nonprofit that is previous 990, which is what nonprofits submit to the IRS to show how much they spend. It had only had a couple of $100, and then a year later, I believe it was within a year, they got a $2 billion grant to Stacey Abrams and her team under the guise that they were going to help the environment. But we all know it ultimately goes into the pockets of people trying to push the political agenda and get votes for the left.
Stacey Abrams out of Georgia, she was foisted upon us several years ago when she was running for governor. Yeah, I'm happy she's no longer in the news, although, you can't take it for granted that they won't bring her back. You said something very smart, and I thought it was very, very intelligent. You said that we have to start exploring moving federal agencies and their headquarters out of Washington, D.C. because of the talent pool that they attract because of where they are geographically. Talk to us about that for a second.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. And I think I'm sensitive to it because I'm from a rural place in Mississippi, a small town where a lot of folks there would never think about going to work for the EPA. But there's a
Yeah.
lot of people that would have really substantive knowledge that could contribute to the true mission of the agency and make it a better place. So if you take a lot of these regional offices in particular, or the DC based offices in particular, and you move them out to various regions around the country, not the big cities, because right now the 10 regional offices, they're all located in Atlanta, San Francisco. I mean, you pick the blue city and there's probably an EPA headquarters over there. You move them outside in areas that can attract all sorts of different all people that have all sorts of different experience. And I really think that that would contribute to a diversity within the agency from an intellect and from an experience perspective, which would lend itself to much better outcomes than what we currently get, which is the pool of talent that goes to Washington, D.C. It's hard to get there. It's really expensive. There's a lot of expense barriers. As an intern working for free, I was lucky to have the support of my parents, but there's a lot of people that can only get to DC if they work 2 to 3 jobs. I certainly did that when I first got there, working for free and working a retail job on the side. So it's hard to get there for a lot of different reasons, and that limits the number or the type of people that you can pull from to work in these agencies. And I just think it would be much better to get out of that DC, Northern Virginia mentality and have the agency truly represent the entirety of the United States, which is what they're designed to do.
I think that is absolutely spot on because even if you get people outside of the big cities, look, I am a big city person. I was born and raised in New York City. I don't know lick about the environment, not as much as someone who was born and raised maybe on a farm or in a rural area. They know more about the environment than I ever will. I'd like to learn, but just as a matter of practicality, as a matter of pragmatism, they're probably the right person for the job more than I am. And then, I mean, just leaving aside the political slant that most people in these big cities have, I think that is a very, very important. I think that's something that should be pursued to take the EPA out of DC and put it smack dab in the middle of Tennessee. And I think I think that would solve a lot of problems, I think.
Yeah, it would. And you have all the amenities. You have airports, you have people, but the other thing it could also do, I think this was a really big point, is you would save so much that the money spends on retaining federal lands in various contracts. There's some places where they pay contracts to be in certain buildings that are very, very expensive. They're some of the most expensive commercial real estate in the entire country. If they move that to other areas where it's not as pricey, you could still have the same space. You could have a better pool of talent, and you would save money for the taxpayers just from a basic operational sense.
That is so smart. Speaking of finances, tell us about this connection with the 16th Amendment.
Yeah, certainly. So, I argue going back that the growth of the federal bureaucracy, it really goes back to the passage of the 16th and the 17th Amendment. Now, the 16th Amendment, this is when there was the establishment of the income tax. And what this really did in going against the original grain, if you will, of our constitutional republic as the founders started it, is that it shifted resources away from staying in the states, and it really shifted those resources in the form of a federal income tax going to Washington, D.C. That was step one in really shifting this balance of a small but important federal entity where the states were more powerful because they're more tied to the people directly and understands the will of the people much better from having the upper hand. It really switched that in a really big way.
I mean, I think the more we decentralize government, the better. And I think that one of the ways that they achieve this grand centralization and giving the federal government powers that they really were not supposed to have and really are not supposed to have is through the financing. So I think that's a very, very important point. You mentioned the Paris Climate Accord a moment ago. I'd like to spend a moment on this because this is also one of those things that made me kind of scratch my head. I remember covering that at the time. This is before I had kind of had my political reawakening here and realized what was really going on. And I remember we made such a big deal about the fact, and President Obama touted this as a victory, and this is a history-making moment. The only problem was India and China took a look at this thing and they were like, nope, and we're not doing that. And it was kind of like they're some of the worst polluters on the planet. How can you tout this as a major achievement if two of the worst offenders are not involved in it? I mean, we were sold a bill of goods on that.
Absolutely. It was worse than that, Mike. The only people who would tout that as a historical agreement, which is how it was characterized across so many headlines, are people who don't really care about the environment. They're pushing these policies for some ulterior motive, mostly control or propping up benefits to their donors that have invested in the second-rate technologies like wind and solar that all these countries are stuck with if they're embracing things like the Paris Climate Accord. But I say it was worse than just being sold a bill of goods. I was there when they were doing these negotiations leading up to the final signing, which was in 2015. And you had representatives of the Obama administration colluding with members of the French foreign ministry. You had a French foreign minister, basically the equivalent of the Secretary of State, that famously said, we must, quote, find a way around Congress. Otherwise, the United States will not join. The latter part is a slight paraphrase, but I'm not far off what he said. Basically, what he was saying and exposing, sometimes they say the quiet part out loud, is that
Yeah.
they were going to create the Paris Climate Accord in a way that it wouldn't trigger the advice and consent mechanisms of the Senate, which are supposed to be a really important check for the American people's voice to be included and covered in international agreements. You had US delegates from the Obama administration working with the French foreign ministers, people in other countries. They were just the ones in charge at that time to try to subvert important checks in their own country so that they could pass this agreement and say and generate all of those headlines. Meanwhile, like you rightly pointed out, China's their internationally determined contribution, which were the country commitments that they were submitting to the UN to prove how great they were going to comply with Paris. China's was a joke, India's was a joke, and Russia's was a joke. All of them were totally skewed, and the worst one was China. There's essentially this is a slight paraphrase, but this is what it said in technical terms: is that their emissions would increase up until 2030, so guaranteed increase, and then at 2030 they would think about whether or not they could decrease. And if not, they would continue to increase it. That's what it said in much more technical terms.
Is that why they called it an accord and not a treaty so they can bypass Congress?
Oh yeah, and it's interesting. There's a lot of legal terms that when they were doing the
What is the difference between an
negotiations.
accord and a treaty, by the way?
Well, not a ton. It's really what's in the legal justification, from the accord versus the treaty. It doesn't really matter what it's called. What matters for purposes of triggering advice and consent in the Senate is that the State Department does something called a Circular 175, which is an analysis looking at the legal justifications to see if that agreement, accord, treaty, whatever you want to call it, rises to the level that it triggers treaty status, and then it goes to advice and goes through the advice and consent process. So really, it's the substantive legal arguments. You can call it whatever, but it's the analysis that really matters.
I mean, this was literally a way for them to circumvent Congress, and circumventing Congress is a big deal because it's really circumventing you and I. It's circumventing the American people. That's what that's about. Tell us what you mean by, and let's spend a couple minutes talking about the book here. Tell us what you mean by some of these political appointees going native. What does that mean?
Well, one of the problems with conservatives in particular, because Republicans, conservatives, whether you're going up as an elected official or you're going up as an appointee, typically we're going to challenge the status quo of how the federal government operates. The problem is a lot of people, when they get to Washington, D.C., they want to become a part of the business of Washington, D.C. It's attractive. All the cool kids are going, and there's some political appointees that will ultimately want to be a part of the status quo of Washington, D.C., and particularly become a part of the bureaucratic class within the various agencies. And they lose sight of, as a conservative, as someone pushing an America First movement, that you're going in to disrupt the status quo, not in an unconstitutional way, but to actually reset the course of the agency back on a constitutional course consistent with the direction of the President of the United States. But there's some appointees that get in there, they go soft for one reason, or go native is another way to basically say that. Losing sight of why you are actually there. You're not necessarily there to make friends. You're not there to be mean. You're not there to be a jerk, but you're not there to make friends and be comfortable. You're there to do a job. And the job that you have as an America First person, or someone who wants to see the federal government shrink in size and scope and reach, is to disrupt the status quo.
I think that's a great way to put it. I think there's too many people who go to Washington, D.C., and their priority becomes staying in Washington, D.C. And how do I become a part of the permanent government? Y'all fired A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. Tell us about this book.
Yeah, so there's three main points. We've kind of covered them, but I'll sum them up very, very well. The first part is my anecdotal experience with the deep state, really starting with being put up in a sex hotel in Bonn, Germany, when I was there to negotiate a better deal than the Paris Climate Accord as directed by the President of the United States. And then just to show readers that, the lengths the deep state would go to try to subvert President Trump, in particular, President Trump's policy actions. The other piece of it, the second part, is it's the wonky piece. It gets into the history of how did we get from our constitutional republic as envisioned and started by the founders to where people start looking to the federal government to solve all of their problems, and this massive unfettered growth of the bureaucracy. I start with the passage of the 16th and then the 17th Amendment, which was how we elect our senators. And then I get into a bit of a deep dive there. The middle part, it's for the wonky folks who want to get on the nitty gritty on the policy. The last part is the most exciting part for me, because I always like to end things on a positive note, and it's what can we do about it? We have this major problem.
Yeah.
What can the reader do, or whoever you are? And the good news is that the Department of Government Efficiency, they've really embraced a lot of these policies in terms of doing coming up with an account of the extent of fraud, waste, and abuse, and then giving that information to the key agency leaders to make significant reforms to once and for all shrink the size and scope in the federal government and restore balance that has been missing for decades.
Gaze into your crystal ball a little bit here, Mandy. What do you see happening with the current administration, Trump round 2.0 here? How do you see things going over the next, let's say, year to year and a half? Does it get a lot better? Are you hearing from folks who that some of these entrenched bureaucrats, people who really don't belong within 100 miles of their roles in official Washington, that some of them are being rooted out? Are we making progress?
Absolutely. From the folks that I've talked to that are in the trenches, they say it's night and day. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that the bureaucrats that are there, they know they can actually be fired now. They used to think that they couldn't, they were untouchable, but that is no longer the case. The other piece of it, they've instituted something along the lines of Schedule F, which is restoring accountability amongst the I say the lower ranks. Really, it includes some senior people, but anyone below what is called a senior executive service or SES designation and under, those folks are now subject to a policy, which means if they're not doing their job or following through with direction, you can build a case to ultimately get them removed. So, because of that restoration of accountability, that restoration of at will employment, like the rest of the world has to essentially operate
Yes.
under,
Yes.
you
Right.
know, they work a lot better, is what I hear. It's really been night and day from early on. And I think a lot of that will continue. And what it means as far as work product and getting things done, you're going to see better worked product. You're not going to have a lot of these problems like legal bombs or technical bombs. You still have to trust but verify, but they're not going to be as bold as they were in the past, they being the deep entrenched bureaucrats at the various agencies. And the work product's going to be much better. And as a result, the policy impacts will be sustained much longer.
I think this is absolutely fantastic. I can think of no more important topic to cover than A, the environment, because we only have one planet Earth, and then B, the deep state and their efforts to kind of thwart real change and giving power back to the country, back to you and I. Congratulations on this book, Mandy. It is a big achievement. And thank you for helping us shine some sunlight on what is really going on in DC. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that it's the best way to show the American people what's really going on.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to share this with you and for the time to engage in this really great conversation.
I hope to have you back real soon.